Actually, that's another good video we could watch. Enemy at the Gates myth busting. Because I've heard this movie's got a lot of problems. When I first watched this movie, I so liked it. Oh, I enjoyed it so much. So everyone knows this scene. Look at this dude. Biting his lip. He's like, oh, this is the bearer of bad news, but this never actually happened. It's dramatized for the film. I mean, deserters were shot, but they were like court-martialed. They weren't just shot in the battlefield with a heavy machine gun blowing ammunition. Reaction to the Soviet charge, Enemy of the Gates, 2001. Is this historically accurate? It's a 20-minute video. This should be pretty fun.
I remember playing this mission in one of the first Call of Duties.
Oh, Call of Duty, yes! Boom.
Welcome to History Legends, and in this video we're going to do a step-by-step analysis of the first battle scene in the movie Enemy at the Gates. But before we start, let's get some context about this story. The movie takes place in September 1942 and follows the story of Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev during the Battle of Stalingrad.
What the hell? Jude Law's way too good looking. The casters were like, let's find someone really looking to play this Russian sniper. Let's like fast forward to the bits. Fast forward to the bits where...
Right off the bat, we notice that the Soviet soldiers are treated like cattle. They're in these big wagons made for animals, and they're pulled out of these wagons out. Another thing that is interesting is the actual railway station at that time was miles away from the Volga River. That means that the soldiers, once they disembarked from the train, either had to walk on the road towards the Volga River or even travel by truck. But it was organized. Here we can see it's a mass of soldiers, cattle just shoved into the battle.
I mean, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It's dramatized for the movie. It represents them as less than human, when in lateral fact, the way they were organized into battle was organized. It wasn't... Guys, let's just think for a second. I want you to really rub your brain cells together for a second. Just think about this for a second. Is this the capabilities of how the Soviet Union could win the war? Now, don't get me wrong. I know a lot of Soviet soldiers died in World War II. But is this representation of Soviet victory really the winning side? Think about that for a second. Really rub those brain cells together. Really give them a good rub.
Right away, if we notice their uniforms, there's also a problem. They all have these little hats, but where are the helmets? If we look at pictures of the Battle of Stalingrad, just the troops moving towards the Volga River, they all had the typical Russian helmet. Also...
Oh yeah, this concept of like, you all given a rifle. Some of them were just giving ammunition. These guys have got SMGs. What the fuck? This concept that the Russian army was just this flock of dudes pushing against the Germans is just a stupid view. You really need to get this out of your head. The truth is that the Soviet Russian army was organized. It was a professional army. They couldn't have won the war otherwise. Come on, use your head. Rub those brain cells together.
Everyone already had weapons. Now the soldiers here are empty-handed. What would empty-handed soldiers do on the front line? And all Soviet soldiers would at least have sort of their cover across their body, a bag, but their personal equipment, not simply uniform and empty-handed towards the boats. However, the movie does a good job at showing the urgency of the Soviet army regarding the Battle of Stalingrad by trying to send as many troops as possible, as fast as possible, across the river to hold the city. However, in this case, they treat the soldiers like cattle, and And I believe this is a common misconception about the Soviet army in regards of how they treated their soldiers. We think they simply sent waves after waves of soldiers, but clearly it wasn't like that. The Soviet army was highly structured and organized. There's another aspect we cannot forget. These soldiers seem to be pushed to the front line against their will. But first of all, what is the worth of soldiers that don't want to fight in battle? Very low. And probably they would have been bathed into Soviet propaganda saying how if the Germans invade, they would all be killed as well as their family.
Oh no, another color
so
photo.
all these men would have all the best reasons to fight.
It reminds me of the generals. You know, in CNC Generals, the Chinese, how they had those little propaganda towers.
Little side note, I once talked to a German World War II veteran and he got wounded by a bullet from an airplane. Now, bullets from airplanes are way bigger than your typical bullet for your rifle. So,
Oh, I never thought of that. Can you imagine the amount of damage it would take if you got hit by a high caliber round from a plane? Oh my God, I never thought of that.
Here we see the impact of the bullet's
If a bullet hit you in the chest from a plane, you would explode. It's a massive caliber round.
Machine gun bullets. However, airplane bullets would have completely crashed into your body and caused great damage. And this is what happened to this German veteran. He said he took one inside his lung and he almost died from it. He was lucky, but he said it was a huge bullet that pierced him and left his body. Otherwise, he would have been killed. But the movie shows the desperation, the fear, portrays this pretty well. The hopelessness. This is how we can explain this scene. You're stuck on a boat. You have no exit. A lot of soldiers would get hopeless and now they're scared for their life.
He's got a comment on that, because that is not true. I'm just shooting deserters that jumped overboard.
Now, the actual story of crossing the Volga is a bit different than depicted in Enemy at the Gates. What the Soviets actually did was transport the troops across the river at night. Of course, that way the German airplanes, but also the sentinels that were along the river, the Germans had a clear view on the river. At night, they could not accurately aim on the Russian boats coming towards Stalingrad.
Oh, it was at night.
The other thing the Soviet leadership did was...
So this is meant to be at night.
The movie shows the desperation, the fear. Along the river, the Germans had a clear view on the river. At night, they could not accurately aim on the Russian boats coming towards Stalingrad. The other thing the Soviet leadership did was to send smaller boats across the river. That way, if some boats would get hit, not the entire crew would perish. It would be limited casualties.
Oh wow, they've all got helmets and guns. What the hell? Not historically accurate. But it's in black and white, so it must be real.
The music is epic, I have to say.
Hans Zimmer. I actually don't know if it is Hans Zimmer, actually. I don't know.
That's an interesting aspect that we just witnessed. The fact that thousands of soldiers, wounded soldiers, would be lying next to each other screaming. So imagine you disembarking from the ship and seeing this must have been pretty traumatic.
Right, this scene is probably the most famous scene of Enemy of the Gates. The whole only one in every two guys gets a gun. Let's see what he says.
This scene is probably the most famous of this movie. However, it is
Whoa, there's an echo.
not true. The truth is, the Soviet army was very well equipped by 1942 and produced millions upon millions of rifles. In this case, Mosin-Nagant, but also some machine guns, mortars, artillery, tanks, airplanes, produced
women in the workforce,
machine guns, mortars, artillery, tanks, airplanes,
total mobilization,
produced anything you could think of, and at a very fast rate. The quality was very good, and you might ask me, what about the ammo? Well, the ammo was plenty as well. That wasn't the
Russian guy speaking English. This video is fake.
problem of the Soviet army. I remember playing this mission in one of the
Why didn't they give Jude Law a gun? God damn, he's Jude Law. Don't they know who he is?
first Call of Duties.
This scene was jaw-dropping when I first saw it. I was like, I had
Several problems
goosebumps.
with this scene. First of all, the Soviet soldiers have machine guns and they're firing at the aircraft as if the Soviets did not have anti-aircraft batteries near the Volga River. However, the most important criticism I have is the fact that these NKVD officers are pushing these men up the hill like cattle, like masses of soldiers without any structure, and this is a common mistake in war movies. The Soviet army was highly structured. You had NCOs at the bottom, you had platoon commanders, company commanders, and these men were perhaps rushed to the front, but within their units. Because what's the point of sending waves of men at the front if there's nobody to give them orders?
Soviet man strong, don't need orders.
I have to stop right away once again. Now, Vasily Zaytsev, the Soviet sniper, was originally in the 276th Rifle Division. In this movie, they're portrayed as inexperienced soldiers. However, this unit, made of Siberian soldiers, was one of the few elite ones because they fought against the Japanese right before World War II. I believe the movie made a mashup of Zaytsev.
Oh, wow, I never made that connection. So the ones that were fought against the Japanese in the border conflict, those were the ones that were defending and attacking Stalingrad?
Real Division and the 13th Guard Rifle Division. I find the story of this.
Just a little thought here. There's nothing that screens out the confidence of a soldier on the battlefield than actual real conflict. You know, you could have training, train them how to fire a gun. You can train them how to take orders. You can train them how to use more complex equipment. But nothing can train you for the actual hearing a bullet whiz by your ear, seeing your comrade next to you fall and bleed out. The screams and the fire and the explosions and the buzzing in your ear, there's an explosion that goes nearby. Nothing can prepare yourself for that. So you think about it, anyone who has experienced any real combat experience, like for instance in the border conflict in Japan, in the Far East, these people are going to be screened out as the best of the absolute best, aren't they? The fact that they were able to withstand some frontline experience and not break down with like PTSD, that really does show what makes an elite fighting force, doesn't it?
Guard Division, dramatically interesting. If you heard Guard Rifle Division, you might believe these men are part of the elite. But because the casualty rates have been so high in a preceding month, a lot of inexperienced replacements arrived in the division right before being sent to Stalingrad. Almost 10,000 inexperienced soldiers were sent on the other side of the Volga to protect and defend the remaining Soviet buildings of Stalingrad. And within 3 days of continuous fighting,
oh no, another color photo.
Only about 300 soldiers survived out of the 10,000 sent in initially. However, the tragic end of this Guards Rifle Division was not the first one and sadly would not be the last one on the Eastern Front.
Alter Jungen. Whoa.
All right, first of all, this is the biggest misconception in this scene. They show the Soviet army attacking. When you think about Soviet soldiers, we always believe they had bayonet charges and wave after wave of men until the Germans, completely overwhelmed, could not resist anymore. But this is the biggest myth. If you look at the map right here, we see that the Soviets were actually the ones defending against German attacks. So these waves of Soviet soldiers were sent to defensive positions and would die on the spot. Another thing that we can't forget is the Soviets did have heavy equipment at Stalingrad. A lot of the tanks were on top of that hill. Most of the fighting took place right beyond that hill because that river crossing was vital for the survival of the defenses in Stalingrad. The Soviet army sent in division after division to hold off the attack as long as possible and at all costs. There's one thing the German army did before entering the city in full force was to bombard the entire city. Now, they hoped that this would make the Soviet morale collapse, but the only thing that collapsed were the buildings. And with all these stones, rubble,
They use that for defensive purposes.
in the way, German tanks and armored vehicles had trouble advancing throughout the city.
Oh, wow.
This was the main strength of the Wehrmacht
Hitler
in 1942.
cooked himself.
Fast movement and tanks. Now, we were in a situation where it was German infantry that had to clean up street after street, building after building, floor after floor, room after room. And this is where these Soviet soldiers intervened. They were shoved into the battle, told to defend this building at all costs. And if the Soviet casualties were enormous, it was the same for the Germans. They had no tactical advantage on the ground. Even worse, the Soviets did a tactic called bear hugging. They would be as close as possible to German positions. That way, German artillery or aviation could not effectively provide tactical support to the troops on the ground. Everything had to be done by the infantry alone, and both sides suffered atrocious casualties. And in the scene, if the Soviets would have attacked, they would have had artillery. Now, in the scene, if the Soviets really would have attacked, they would have had an intense artillery barrage right before. Machine guns would have provided direct cover. Mortars would have helped. And the soldiers would have charged forward, all with decent equipment, machine guns and rifles, a lot of ammo. They would jump from one wall to another, to one hiding spot to another, but they were not charging in open ground like that. What I find funny is when the Germans fight the Soviets, their aim is spot on. They don't even have to aim. They kill an enemy soldier at every time.
They got storm, like the opposite of stormtrooper aim.
But when they fight Americans, all of a sudden, stormtrooper aim.
This guy's me. He's Russian feedback. If I was one of those extras that got shot, I would have had a dramatic death. It'd be like, I'd be like, I want to make the final cut, and I would be like, that's me. That's me.
He doesn't even have a helmet.
He doesn't have a gun either.
Not a step back.
I am really curious what he's going to say to this.
Remember that one.
No step back. Oh, he said the line. He said it. No step back.
Now, this is perhaps another of the most famous scenes of this movie.
By the
NKVD soldiers placing machine guns at the back of their own men and shooting down anyone that would dare retreat and abandon the assault. Now, once again, this is an over-dramatization of reality. Not a step back stems from order number 227. However, this order was not meant to individual soldiers or individual units, but more to generals of Soviet divisions that were told to defend an area at all costs, but soldiers were allowed to retreat and withdraw 100 meters as long as it was structured retreat. NKVD units were very similar to military police. They were put at the back of every division. They were not tasked to kill anyone that would retreat. On the contrary, they were there to organize these soldiers. Every fleeing soldier, all the retreating units, they would be there to block them, reorganize them, and avoid a mass withdrawal. They actually saved the Soviet army from total collapse multiple times. Once the soldiers were put back together, they were sent back to their corresponding units, or sometimes they created a new unit.
That's another issue with these old photos as well. Not only, obviously, the black and white, but look at the saturation. The contrast is way too high. Like the blacks are too black and the whites are too white. So it's like they're very difficult to make out what's actually going on. Like you can't see anyone's faces in this.
The spot if necessary. In 1941, for example, 133,000 men were arrested by the NKVD. 1,000 of them, less than 1%, were shot. 4,000 were arrested and imprisoned. All the others were sent back to the units. Only rarely fleeing soldiers would be sent to penal battalions, but this also existed in the German army. Now, if you're interested in first-hand accounts of the Battle of Stalingrad, either from the German perspective or the Italian perspective, Romanian perspective, and above all, the Soviet perspective, I highly recommend you to have a look at this book that I wrote. It has hundreds of first-hand accounts of the battle handed to me from their descendants through my Instagram page. Now you can have all these stories from every perspective right here, and the link will be in the bio. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and let me know what you thought about my analysis.
Guys, I think the hardest thing to chew with this video, the hardest bite to take, is accepting that movie you loved as a child, Enemy at the Gates, I would say No Step Back then, is just a load of shit. And the truth is, it is. It is. You could do your own research. Oh, fuck. He just said it. He said the line. You do your own research, guys, and you can look up that movie. And I have done a long time ago. But when I first heard that movie was full of shit, I did the exact same thing that you did. I pushed back heavily. I said, oh, it's wrong. Oh, it's exaggerated. Oh, it happened somewhere. I'm sorry to break it to you, but Enemy at the Gates is a load of shit. It's just a bit of Hollywood, okay? Please watch it as a piece of entertainment. It is not a historical reenacting of the events at Stalingrad. I know. Boo-hoo. Such a spoiled sport. Wah, 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 wah.